Hello everyone. So the focus of today's video is to have a look at some basic professional services functionality inside Dynamics AX 2012 and specifically around time and materials projects. And there are in fact three levels of project or three types of project you can do. You can just see me moving through them here. We have a core services project, which is purely around time and materials, which is basically accumulating cost on profit and loss. The second option here is we have the same concept, so you'll be accruing your costs onto P&L, but will also accrue revenue as we go along. So you will have matching, so every time you accrue a cost, you will see revenue appear on your P&L as well. And the third option here is just using a balance sheet WIP. So whenever you accrue costs over the life of your project, those costs will instead go to your balance sheet to a WIP account and will come out to your P&L when you decide to invoice. So to make all this happen, there are two core areas that you need to be concerned about. So if we just go into projects here and go into posting and project groups, one of the two key elements to driving how this works is your project group setup. And we'll do the basic one first, which is the first one I mentioned, which is my time and materials with no accruals. So this will take your costs and put your costs straight to P&L, no recognition of revenue, nothing going to balance sheet. It's just purely cost. All you need to do to make this happen is your project type up here. You can see me indicate up here under general here. You need to see a project type of time and material. And down here in the ledger section, where do I want to put my costs for my project? Well, I want them to go straight to P&L. That's all you need to do in your project group. Let's minimize that down. If we come down to line properties, if this is a chargeable project, all you need to have is a line property with this chargeable box ticked, and that will be enough. So I'll just move that out of the way. We'll go back to our projects. If we just look at our services project here, our base time material, just for the purposes of today, I'll just use an hours journal just to show you how things post through. So I'll just create a new one of those. Choose my category. And I'm going to expend, say, 4 hours on this project. So if I post that now, close that down. If we go and look at our posted transaction, what we can see is I have a cost amount of $200. That's my recovery amount. That's my internal charge for the time that I've spent on this project. And I'm going to bill a total amount of $480. And so far, if we scroll down to the end here, it just has a status of chargeable. I've done nothing with it so far. It's just a transaction waiting for me to deal with. If we go and have a look at General Ledger and see the voucher that I've got, I have got $200 sitting there as cost of sales on my P&L, and I have a labour recovery of $200. No invoice amounts or revenue amounts as yet. If we close that down and go and invoice, post that through. If we go back to my transaction now, you'll see its status has now changed to fully invoiced. And if we go and see what's happened on General Ledger, I still have my initial two entries that you saw there before, which was my labour cost and my labour recovery. But now, down here, I've got my customer amount, $528, my invoice revenue, and my GST. So that is your basic time materials project. We're accumulating costs on P&L, but nothing to balance sheet and no revenue accruals. So if we just go back to our project list, The next one I wanted to have a look at was the same thing. We will do exactly the same transaction. We will put a 4-hour journal through my project, but this time what will happen is we will accrue revenue as we incur costs. So that means you will have proper matching on your P&L. So for every cost that I have, I will now have a revenue as well. The way that that works, if we come back first of all to our project group and go and have a look at my accrued revenue project group, it's very similar to the one before. The only difference is now you will see on the right hand side over here under ledger, I'm accruing revenue for hours, expense and item. So what that means is whenever I put my costs to P&L, I now want to see some revenue going to P&L as well. Now the other thing you will need, remember I said before we had project groups and line properties that drive all of this. On the line property, on my chargeable line property here, I now have to mark accrue revenue. So once I have accrue revenue marked here and the accruals ticked on my project group, we will now get our revenue accruals happening. So I'll come back to my project here, so my project with accrued revenue, and we'll do the same thing again. We'll just put an hours journal through. Yep. And we'll put 4 hours on again. So the same numbers we saw before, but this time we'll see some revenue accruals. Okay, and close. All right, so on my transactions now, it doesn't look any different. I still have my sales amount of 480, my cost amount of 200, and an invoice status of chargeable. But if we go and look at my GL vouchers now, I've got some extra transactions. So the bottom one you see here, these bottom two lines, these are the $200 that we saw before. They're my cost recoveries. But sitting up here, I've got a credit to my income of 480, the amount I expect to bill, and I have an accrued revenue amount on my balance sheet now of $480. So that means I now have on my P&L my revenues and my expenses matched up. Now we'll go and invoice that. And what we will see as a result of that invoice, when we now go and look at our general ledger transactions, is the $480 out of my accrued revenue has now been reversed up here, and we have the proper revenue accounts in place. So in summary, what that's done for you is it's given you revenue throughout the cost accumulation process. That accumulated or accrued revenue has been reversed when you've invoiced, and you then have a replacement of that revenue account with the actual invoiced revenue and your GST and your customer transaction. Now our last time and materials project here is again a services project, but this time with WIP. So what I mean with WIP is instead of putting our costs onto our balance, onto our profit and loss, or trying to accrue revenue, what we're going to do instead is we are going to hold the costs on the balance sheet, and once the project is invoiced, or once the month or the transactions are invoiced, those transactions will leave the balance sheet, they will go to the profit and loss as costs, and you'll hit the profit and loss with the revenue at the same time as part of that invoicing process. So again, we'll go back to our project groups and our line properties. What do we need to do to actually make this happen for you? So if we have a look at my time and materials work in progress, my time and materials balance sheet accumulation, in other words, for my project, the big difference is here in the little ledger section. So whereas before I had post cost to P&L, now I'm posting all of my costs to balance sheet. And on my line property, I need to see capitalised cost marked on my line property. So if I want my costs to go to balance sheet, I need on my groups all these marked as balance. On my line property, I need to see capitalised cost. I'll just close these down. What does that look like when we actually transact with it? Well, again, we'll just use the same journal. I'll go and create some hours. $4 hours again. And my transactions this time, it's my 480 sales amount expected, my total cost of 200. What I have this time is I've got my normal labour recovery, this first line here, my negative 200, my credit. But my debit this time, instead of debiting some kind of labour expense on P&L, is now debiting work in progress. So that will stay on the balance sheet until we actually go and generate our invoice, which is what we'll do now. All that. Okay, so this has now gone to status invoiced. If we go and look at our voucher transactions now, what's happened? If we start from the top, you will see we have our credit up here and our debit, our $200. We have our customer transaction here. And down the bottom here, we have the reversal out of the balance sheet of my accrued costs. Those movements between the 4200 account. So that $200 worth of labour cost that I had sitting on my balance sheet as part of my WIP accrual has now been credited out and debited back through to P&L. So now my P&L has my costs out of balance sheet along with the invoice revenue that we've just generated as part of the invoicing process. Okay, so what we have just seen is effectively 3 ways of managing time and materials projects for professional services through AX. You have seen just your normal revenue recognition at time of invoicing, which means you're accumulating costs to P&L as you go and invoicing potentially at the end of the month or at the end of the project. We have seen accrued revenue, so every time I incur a cost, I can put revenue on my profit and loss, so I have matching as I go through the project. Or my third option, my service project with WIP, which means I can accumulate my costs on my balance sheet and just transfer them through to P&L along with my revenue when I run the invoicing process. And don't forget the 2 key elements to this are your project groups and your line properties. In conjunction, those 2 things will drive how your projects will post through AX. So that's all for this video, and thank you very much for listening.